This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Dr. Valandra, it's been a long time coming, but welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
Well, I would say that I am an indigenous person. My nation, we call ourselves the Ochete Shakoi Oyate. Our language that we speak is Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. And our territory is the Northern Plains. Maybe to give the listeners kind of a geospatial orientation. It includes all of South Dakota, North Dakota, most of Nebraska, parts of Wyoming, parts of Montana, the southern provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Minnesota as well. So we have a very expansive territory, which is settler occupied. I might add that, illegally, of course, but that is basically our homeland, and born and raised there in what we call, what is also called the Great Sioux Nation. So yeah, I'm about as indigenous as one can get in North America.
Who are you?
Who am I? Well, I think the protocols would really demand a lot more detail than I have given within nation. I mean, when we talk to each other, we go through a whole protocol so we can position ourselves. But I think that is something that most settlers would be too much detail. For one, it involves the use of the Lakota language, and you get lost in the nuances. So who am I? I would say I am a resistor. You know, been questioning colonization forever. I am a father. I have 3 children. The youngest one is up in British Columbia, on the front lines of the Onestotan or Wet'suwet'en resistance that has caught a lot of attention up in Canada. And she's 8 years old, and she's quite a fighter. She's in the front lines. And so I have to give a shout out to my Wet'suwet'en relatives up there in their struggle against Coastal Link gas line. And of course, against the province of British Columbia, and of course the Canadian settler state itself. So yeah, a father, and also I got several siblings, several relatives. We in our community, we generally joke that, you know, we're practically related to 99% of the population of our nation, just because how we have a kinship system set up. So that's a little bit more personal biography. I know you said you're going to ask me 7 times, but hopefully I can take 3 or 4 of them at one swap there. The other thing is I've been educated in the West. You know, I have a bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. So I know that. So I'm very much Western educated, and I do a lot of writing. You know, one time as an undergraduate, I came home to on a visit. Of course, back then we had some of the senior citizen centers, not nursing homes or anything, but these were centers for the elderly to come and provide meals and things like that. And so I dropped in one time just to see my grandmas and grandpas and other elderly of the community. And my grandma, she asked me, what was I studying in college? And I had told her that, well, I am studying how the white man thinks. She heard me say, to her ears, she heard me say, I am studying to think like a white man. And I proceeded to get a lecture and in front of all the other elders. And so she really lectured me about the strength of the Lakota mind, Lakota logic, the strength of our thinking processes. And, why would I want to think like a white man? Well, of course, I sat there and I listened. It's not us. It's not for me to correct an elder in front of everyone else, particularly other elders. So I sat there and just listened. And then after she gave me the lecture, I leaned over to her and I said, Grandma, I said, I'm learning how they think. I don't want to think like one. And she said, oh. And so that was, and I got those kind of messages the whole time I was getting this westernized education. Community members would always remind me, who I am. And it's okay to get this education, but please do not get seduced by it. Do not get co-opted by it. And just remember who you are.
We'll take a couple of the who are yous off there. Let's get two more in. Who are you?
Maybe this might be the last one, but I work for Living Justice Press, which is a small nonprofit press who specialize in circle processes, restorative justice, and restorative practices. And they have an indigenous line as well, but mainly their focus is circles, RJ and RP. And I just came on board with them in June of 2020. So I just recent, but I've been affiliated with Living Justice Press for a long time. I mean, I would engage with them, do some work for them, but I came on board. And prior to that, I was a senior administrator for our native school, K-12. Spent 4 years as a senior administrator, focusing on faculty development, professional development. And then before that, I was a university professor for the longest time in Native studies. So
beautiful. You got one more in you? Who are you?
Gosh, you'd probably have to contact the FBI or someone like that to get that other part. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get into the intersections of so many of those things right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Edward Valandra to the podcast. Edward is a restorative justice practitioner as well as an Indigenous justice advocate. You will hear so much about decolonization and Indigenous justice in this episode. Without further ado, let's get back into it.
Well, Edward, again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing with us so much that you've already shared. It's always good to check in at the start of the conversation. So to the extent that you want to answer the question in this moment, how are you?
I am good. I am, again, I think I'm busy with some of the projects I think we might mention later on in the program, but I'm good. I'm surviving the cold northern winters up here. So that's always good. But overall, yeah, thanks for asking. I'm doing well.
Yeah, and it's so good to hear in the midst of everything that's going on in the world, we still have the ability to say that we ourselves in the places that we're in are well. Glad to hear it. As you shared in your introduction, you've been doing this work around decolonization and maybe around the words quote unquote restorative justice for a long time, but probably before you even knew the words restorative justice, both in English and as a concept. So in your own words, how did this journey of this quote unquote restorative justice life get started for you?
Back in not June, but April of 2018, I attended a conference, and one of the questions related to what yours was, how did you come into restorative justice? So my response was, I was born into it, basically. Again, we didn't call it restorative justice, but how we engaged in interpersonal relationships in a community really had all the elements that restorative justice talks about, building relationships. And of course, I think what differentiates our notion of restorative justice is we're not so much about building and establish relationships in my community as much as we're born into those relationships. And what I mean by that is we have an extensive kinship system. So as you're born into that kinship system, you're already born into a mutually set of obligations and responsibilities to your relatives. And so the bottom line of that kinship system is to do no harm. Of course, we didn't call it restorative justice, but it was the elements that define restorative justice are certainly there. And I think because of settler colonialization, it's hard to practice that kinship system in which you have to be a good relative and you do no harm. And because of the westernization effect, it has really stressed in a way that it has disrupted those systems as we know them. And that probably goes into the notion of decolonization as well. We're doing decolonization work before we even realized it was decolonization. And so it's interesting as a professor, when I would talk to Native students about colonization and its manifestations, those students would say, well, I felt all of that, I experienced all that, but now I understand the framework of those experiences. In other words, I think sometimes we need some conceptualization to make sense of the experience. And so again, we probably have experienced a lot of these things, but when we learn what colonization is, the light bulb goes off. When we become aware of restorative justice, the light bulb goes off, and it's like, yeah, we've been doing that. We understand that's what it is. We just didn't call it that.
Yeah. What comes to mind, are the words of Adrian Rich, and they were highlighted to me by Bell Hooks. Adrian Rich was someone who survived the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And, in a poem she wrote to her people, like, these are the oppressors' words. This is the oppressor's language, but I need them to speak with you, right? So to use the English language, right, to put things in terms of like colonization and build those frameworks to describe the processes, the things that people have encountered, the systems that people have encountered that name the harm and show how the harm was systemically built into the way that we are, like, is really important. But you said a word that has stuck out to me since I heard you speak in Denver in 2019 at the NACRJ conference, and you'll be speaking at the 2022 one this coming summer. But this idea of being good relatives is really at the core of what this is. And restorative justice the words restorative justice don't necessarily equate to being good relatives in English. Is there a phrase in one of your languages that really gets to that idea? Because I struggle with like the idea of restorative justice, both the English words being colonized words, but like those words also being so limiting to like, oh, how do we repair harm? But is there a phrase or a word in one of your languages that really gets to that idea? And I'm not saying that for like appropriation reasons, but like, English is so limited.
Well, there's actually, one of the things about native languages, particularly the Lakota languages, it is a very descriptive language, and it's also a verb-based, not noun-based like English. So a lot of the words that we have exemplify motion or action or the state of being. Even like the word Lakota or Dakota or Nakota, that is a state of being, and that's actually being a relative. That's verb form in which you're engaged in being a relative. And out of the what would be millions of words, there's one that I hear quite frequently among several others, but this one about Wolakota. And Wolakota, not a literal translation, but a close translation would mean peace. Yeah, peace or being peaceful. It just really is a word that we hear a lot where I'm from. To be Wolakota is to be at peace, is to be in the act of peace, always peaceful intention. So that would be one example, I think, of a vocabulary that has meaning that would be related to restorative justice.
I think about the limits of like that literal translation between between languages, right? Where being at peace in English, I'm sure doesn't like fully describe the idea that you're talking about, because within English, right, there can be like negative peace where like, oh, there's no conflict, versus like, oh, we are in good relation. Another word or phrase in Lakota that has resonated with me over time, just because I've been able to identify it across a couple of different languages, like phrases like Metakweasan, right? We're all relatives, or like, and like when I think about different indigenous people across the world, phrases like Ubuntu, like I am, because we are in Lakech, Alaken, I am another you, you are another me. When I think about Babayan, which is a pre-colonial language of the Philippines, Kapwa, right? Like the interconnection between all beings. That gets to the idea of like, we're connected, we're relatives, but it's not necessarily about like, I think you can assume that like, oh, because of that relationship, be good to each other, be in good relationship, but it doesn't necessarily say that verbiage. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to think about words beyond restorative justice, because I think, you've created and you've co-created with many authors this effort of colorizing restorative justice, bringing in voices, centering voices that have not been recognized, privileged, or even acknowledged in this greater movement that's been happening since the late 70s, early 80s. But I think those words, restorative justice, are so limiting. I'm thinking about like the chapter that Christiane, Erica, and Michelle wrote, where it's like, burning this bridge. Like, is this something that we should be even engaging with? And part of me says yes, because like these are common words that people are able to grasp onto, and we can move them towards being in better relationship with each other, reducing harm that's happening within schools, the criminal legal system, society at large. And the other part of me says like, yeah, but we're still bastardizing some of these other ideas. And I don't know that you have like, I'm sure you don't have like, here's the like cure-all silver bullet answer. But when you think about the use of those words, what comes up for you?
You mean like burning the bridge and
No, like using the language restorative justice
oh,
versus creating something new that we're moving people towards that is more inclusive or more reflective of this relational way of being together.
I guess you use the tools at hand. And one of the things I appreciate about restorative justice is one of the defining definitions is to address harms as a result of wrongdoing. I mean, I think that that has that definition has jumped out at me as, yeah, that would be a good place to start. But I also know, and there's been criticisms within the indigenous world, is especially with settlers, is what is there to restore? What relationship has there been that needs to be restored? And so one of the criticisms, I think, from indigenous peoples, and maybe that may somewhat come out of the burning of the bridges, but I can't really speak for the contributors, but it's like, what is it we're trying to restore here? Certainly there's a justice part of that, but if we've not had any relationship with settlers on a scale of goodwill, of friendship, of reciprocity, it's always been basically a one-way street. I think some of the indigenous people that I've talked about that do this kind of work, they may prefer terms like restorative practices,
Mm-hmm.
for example. So I think, there's a lot of things that are good about restorative justice, but again, when we use terminology and phrases, we all come to those phrases probably with a different set of experiences. And so it has to be very nuanced as you get into that. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I wrote that chapter on doing the first harm, settlers in restorative justice, and calling attention to what does it mean to be a settler in restorative justice, particularly with indigenous peoples. The first harm being the theft of land through genocide, and every harm, one could argue, because of that first harm, all other harms have resulted as a result or because of. And so for settlers to talk about restorative justice, undoing harms, establishing relationships, it seems somewhat hollow and very superficial as an indigenous person sitting in a room full of settlers and talking about undoing harms. And I'm sitting there going like, well, what about the first harm?
Yeah.
Why not address that? Why not talk about that and how to make that right? So there's a lot of deep self-reflective questions that come up when indigenous peoples and settlers get into the same space. And there's this presumption that we can start at somewhere down the line at what settlers would determine is restorative justice, and indigenous people say, you got to go back to like 1492
Mm-hmm.
and begin there,
Yeah.
and then start that process.
If we were running a workshop right now, we thinking about the harm that happened above the iceberg and then like everything that contributed to it going on underneath the iceberg. Those things are deep, and within a quote unquote circle process that's happening in a school or something that's happening within the criminal legal system, where you're just focused on, this student threw a chair across the classroom, or this person stole from, this from this store. Like, yes, that's not something that they should have done, right? But what about the harm that has happened to them? What about the land theft and the genocide, right? What about and we can go like up throughout history, like what about the enslavement of their people and kidnapping, right? And then what about the forced assimilation into boarding schools, right? Separation from their people. What about the systemic housing discrimination that withdrew resources from certain communities? How are we addressing those harms? You're talking about restoring this, $5 candy bar that somebody took, right?
Right.
Like that can ring hollow. When I read your chapter, and I've heard you say before, the first thing that many people do when they wake up in the morning is set foot on stolen land, right? Um, that's a reflection that I think about, because I'm curious for you. Like, do you think about settler colonizers and settler immigrant refugees differently? As someone who is biracial, right? Somebody who has ancestors that were kidnapped from West Africa, and someone whose ancestors also aligned with U.S. imperialism and joined the U.S. Military from the Philippines and then came here. Like, is there a distinction in your mind, between settler colonizers, people who have ancestry in Europe and came here, and people who have come here against their will, or economic refugees?
Well, I think, one of the things we have to recognize about settler and settler colonialism, and it's helpful, like Patrick Wolf began that narrative or that dialogue about settler colonialism, and he was very emphatic about saying settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. So I think, to your point of describing earlier, one of the issues, let's say with restorative justice, initially was it was usually between individuals, and so it was so restorative justice dealt with someone who did a harm and someone who was harmed very much at a micro level of individual to individual, not really understanding the systemic nature of why that is. Economic disparities, health disparities, educational disparities, all these disparities that exist may result from people having to, let's say, in an economically depressed area, maybe they're engaged in an activity that provides them an income of some kind, but is against the law. And so they go after the superficial behavior. Oh, you broke the law, but not really going deep into what's the structure out there that allows for behavior that is deemed illegal. So I think moving to that and talking about settlers, I tend to look at it as a structure, of course. Mm-hmm. That what is it about that structure that makes it so powerful and so enlightening to the immigrants that come here? I mean, I'm sure that's the last thing they think about is like, oh, I'm going to become a settler. Well, I think what happens is, because of settler colonialism and the structure that's set there, one of the things about being a settler, not explicitly stated, but you're going to displace indigenous peoples. And that displacement means either you're going to kill them, remove them, or dispossess them in some form or manner, even though you may have come from an area of the world in which you had to leave for economic reasons or for other reasons. So I think one of the things that I would argue about settler colonialism that is not articulated is people then are, and that's why it's a structure, because it's past, present, and future. And so what would it have been if settlers, quote unquote, came to this part of the world and said to indigenous peoples, this is your land, we are guests, how can we be in a good way? Can you imagine? Well, it's even hard to imagine that now, but the initial settlers had in their power to say, there are indigenous peoples here, they own this land. What is it that we can do in order to make our lives better? And I think that's part of the issue. I think So and there are, and you've raised the question, but there are other writings just now coming out where we have settlers of color now who are beginning to say, what is this thing called settler colonialism? And what's my role in that? Because as settlers of color, they're still oppressed by racism. And we see that in the States when you hear white settlers telling settlers of color that they're not legitimate settlers. In other words, they're not entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities that white settlers have. And so that's something I think settlers of color are going to have to kind of negotiate that space of they're settlers, but because of racism, they might not be legitimate settlers. The birther movement, all of this stuff. So even within that settler sphere, settlers themselves are trying to determine who is the authentic settler. And I think that is something that they have to work out. But for us, settlers are going to have to, I think when we say settlers, it's people who have come to displace us. And through this notion of the logic of elimination, there's a lot of structural things in place that are genocidal. And so when people come to this country as immigrants, I mean, that's the big story, right? This is a land of immigrants. This is a country of immigrants. That's erasure right there. I'm not an immigrant. We have stories going back since time immemorial that we were always here. And I challenge any settler to find a native origin story that says they crossed the Bering Strait. Zero. All our stories of our origins are somewhere on this Western hemisphere. So when the immigrant story, or when the story is told that this is a nation of immigrants, we're erased right off the bat. Can a settler honestly feel good about that? That they're erasing millions of people that's already been here before they even knew this part of the world even existed, and that legacy is still continuous. So those are the deep questions. And this is one of the reasons I talk about when Indigenous people walk into a room full of settlers, settler fragility sets in right away, because our very presence contests their legitimacy in this world. And so the notion of authenticity comes into play, because one of the things is settler colonialism is all about erasure, the logic of elimination. So if we're still here, then that upsets the settler narrative. It unsettles them. And heaven forbid, should an Indigenous person walk into a circle of settlers or a room full of settlers and say, we have the right to coexist. Not only that, but we want land returned. And then, like white fragility, settler fragility sets in too. And then we have this discomfort and awkwardness. But that's fine. I think, Erica Little Wolf has said to whites and settlers alike, just sit in that zone of discomfort. It's good for you. It's healing for you. It's not always a bad thing, the fact that you feel threatened.
Yeah. I think one of the things that people jump to is like, well, what do we do about it, right? How do we fix it? And it's not that simple to say land back, right? It's just like saying like reparations. Great. What does that mean? I think there are larger systemic things that can happen that I'll admit, like, I don't necessarily have the vision for, because, you can think about things that have been done, like in Oklahoma recently, but on a national level, like even Canada, who went through a quote unquote truth and reconciliation process, like what has that actually resulted in? What are impacts of either like micro or macro land back efforts that you've seen work well, like both on a systemic or like I appreciate the framing that you gave around, we're guests. How do we coexist in a good way in this space that is, yours and your ancestors?
Well, what's interesting about the settler narrative is they make it such that for indigenous people to ask for the return of land, they make that sound like that's a huge ask. Mm-hmm. But what settlers don't realize is they've asked so much from us. So if we have a document called a treaty that outlines our territory, and in that treaty it says no settler shall ever be in that area because it's recognized as our nation. And then in the 21st century, there's settlers all over our homelands. That's not a big ask to question those settlers. What are you doing here? And they get offended. And then you show them this document called a treaty, which is an international agreement between two nations. And you read that line to them, it says, right here, it says, other than indigenous people, no one else has a right to be here. So what are you doing here? And that's not even a big ask. That's something that, let's say, my Lakota ancestors and the settlers' ancestors said back in 1868, this area will be recognized as the Lakota Nation or the Great Sioux Nation. And they have all the sovereignty of any nation in the world. So forward 100 and some years later, we have settlers all over our homelands. And I would argue those are the undocumented immigrants. What are they doing here? And so when you just ask that question, you see settlers get upset, they get angry, they start, then they just for asking a question. And it's not even a big ask. We're just saying, you made an agreement with us. Why don't you honor it? What kind of people are you that make agreements and don't honor them? You might have a PR problem as a result of that, not only among indigenous people, but all other nations of the globe might look at settlers from the US as not being worthy of their word. So it has broader implications. I think what may bother settlers is, as indigenous people, we've known settlers longer than almost anyone in the entire world. So we know their deep, dark secrets. We know where the skeletons are buried. And we know that settlers' closets, their skeletons still have meat on them. So this becomes one of deep issues of who you are as a person. Who do you represent? I mean, what do you represent? That is perhaps the ethical and moral dilemma when indigenous peoples and settlers face each other. We have to have that honest and authentic conversation. As uncomfortable as that might be, it still is one that has to happen.
And I appreciate you bringing Erica's words in, like, to be able to sit in that uncomfortability is what's so necessary. I mean, it's what restorative justice practitioners ask everyone to do when you come into a circle process where you're confronting the harm that either you have caused or the harm that, has happened to you. Like, that is a place of growth. And, if we're being true to quote unquote restorative principles, right? Like, there is no predetermined outcome of like XYZ. This is what happens. Like, it's both in like that internal reflection and within the context of the relationship that we move towards being back in good relationship, or like creating a relationship that is good, in balance. Have there been, like, like I appreciate you going where you did with that, but I'm thinking what comes to mind is like, have there been examples that come to mind for you of that happening well on a micro or macro level?
Well, it's interesting that we talk about the micro level. I mean, I think it's one thing to engage on a one-to-one level, and that's one thing. I think there have been settlers who have taken actions as allies, and so that's much appreciated. You know, the one-to-one level certainly doesn't, you know, reflect that structural dimension. I mean, I have met many white settlers who don't agree with what's going on with you know, with respect to the land return issue. I mean, they're allies for that, but this has to be really at a more of a group level, a larger level, because I've heard over the course of my life, you know, many white settlers who disagree with why not just return the land. Well, that's only one voice, but I think it has to happen at a peoples to peoples level. Really, it does. Because the numbers aren't just there. So many settlers from cradle to grave are inculcated with this settler narrative. They can't even think outside of that framework, and then they personalize it so much. So an educative process about who settlers are, what their behavioral patterns consist of, what their narrative is. I mean, it's a huge undertaking. And so to answer your question, I haven't really seen that happen at a micro level. I have seen, and I'm looking at one, I think the Taos people in the Southwest had returned to them, I think 20,000 acres of land to them, but that is such an outlier. And then when I seen my Wet'suwet'en relatives up in British Columbia, now there I think that's such a good model for settlers of how to address issues, because the settlers there stepped up when the RCMPs went in and started assaulting the sovereignty of the Wet'suwet'en people. And what happened across Canada, I think in February of 2020, settlers in support of the Wet'suwet'en people shut down Canada for a period of a week or something like that. So there's examples, I think, up in Canada that might help serve as a roadmap to how settlers can really become allies and then develop those crucial relationships that are going to serve everyone down the line, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. I mean, this is a long-term resistance, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about 500 years plus, and
Right.
you know, we're talking about small actions that happen, but like those things do add up. There are things that you're calling for people who are settlers, not even just people who call themselves quote unquote restorative justice practitioners, to think about, and I think that's really helpful, really insightful, and I know that I'm going to listen back on this conversation and do a little bit more reflection. I'm sure others will too. But, you know, you talked about how you started working with Living Justice Press a couple years back to bring about a project around centering voices that have been historically marginalized, erased, excluded from this greater restorative justice movement. It culminated in this book called Colorizing Restorative Justice. We've had many of the contributing authors on these airwaves, but can you talk about the origins of that project and why it was important for you to, you know, bring these voices together?
You know, Denise Breton, who's the executive director of LJP, I think we should give a shout out to her. She'll tell a better story than I will, but she was doing like an ad for their books, and she recalls seeing in that ad, you know, they featured some of the authors and they were all white. Mm-hmm. And she said that was and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but it sounded to me like that was an epiphany for her. I mean, she's been thinking about other voices, non-white voices, but that ad and then just seeing basically all white authors or pictures of all white authors, at that point, she had just said, we got to do something. I have to do something. And because I had an association with LJP for several years, we had a talk, and I said, well, I suggest that what we do is let's do a call. And so and we've heard criticisms of restorative justice, the ones that you were raising in this podcast. I mean, they were out there. So then when we put the call together, we wanted to say, what has been kind of the journey of restorative justice up to that point. And so I did a lot of research. I went to a lot of the databases and did search terms on restorative justice, restorative practice. And I don't know, I must have downloaded about 75 articles from over a 30-year period. And it was very clear that much of RJ has been written by whites. And that was very clear in the literature. And so it supported what, let's say, practitioners of color were saying about their marginalized role in restorative justice. Who gets the gigs? Who gets invited to speak? Who gets the circle keep? Who gets credential? I mean, all these questions. So then so we put out a call. And to be honest, we didn't really know what to expect. We didn't know if we'd get, because we asked for abstracts basically. And we didn't know if we were going to get, a dozen. We had no idea. And we ended up with 64 submissions of abstracts. And so that told us that people of color and indigenous people in restorative justice, our restorative practice, our in community justice, our transformational justice, social justice, that resonated with them. So we got that many, and of course, then we had to go through and select the ones that we had, the contributors now. And I would have to say it was a very difficult choice, because if we tried to publish every one, we'd have like a 8-volume set of colorizing RJ. And so that was the origins of that call. And then of the book, it was saying that people of color, indigenous people that have been involved in restorative justice or restorative practices really had something to contribute and say about the state of restorative justice or restorative practice. And so, I'd have to give a shout out to all those who submitted an abstract, and then for those contributors who submitted their manuscripts. They're the real heroes in all of this. I mean, they were the ones that really made it pop. And so, I'm just grateful that people stepped up and submitted things for this call. So that's kind of the short story of CRJ. It was fun working with all of them. We have become a community in and of ourselves. And so again, that has been for me, it's been very affirming that I think communities of color, indigenous people have always taken a critical look at the status quo in this country and have applied those critical frameworks to make restorative justice a lot more accessible and open. So it's been good in a lot of ways, and I really am happy with the result of that process.
Yeah. What are some of the things that stand out to you as like, oh, I'm so glad that this has happened? One of the things I know you're going to say, just the relationships that you have with all of those authors. So I'll give you your piece to say that, but external impacts, like what are some of the things that you've seen as well?
I think it has shifted the conversation in the restorative justice movement or the restorative practice movement. I think having a text like CRJ in the hands of RJ practitioners of color and indigenous can hold on to that book and say, these are the things we have been thinking about. 20 other people are also thinking about this, and it's in print, and it's a hard copy. It's very material. You can hold on to it and you can reference it, and then they can go into their circle, their organizations are in their communities, and say, people are naming these things now. They're voicing their realities, if you will, and these are all experience-based. So I think that has shifted the conversation in the restorative justice movement and restorative practices to one in which, things like race gets centered now. I mean, it's no longer one of those silences that just sit there. I think settler colonialism has been outed in a way. So I think what that has done, it has encouraged or stimulated a dialogue within the restorative justice movement about its shortcomings and what can be done more to make it more representative and reflective of the communities that are using it. So I think that's one of the major things that has happened. It certainly has shifted the conversation.
Yeah, I can definitely reflect just on my work within the context of Amplify RJ, when I talk about values of restorative justice being equity. Of course, as a Black and Filipino person, I'm thinking through a racial lens. And when I say equity, I'm not just talking about treat everybody the same. I'm talking about what are the things that folks all across intersectional identities, both their race, but gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, etc. But race was just thrown in there. Not just because of this book, also because of the quote unquote racial reckoning of 2020. It's been even more important for me to say, this is restorative justice with an anti-racist lens, right? And I've seen many practitioners across the space having to do that. Some of them still haven't, but we'll get there hopefully, or hopefully people will be able to start challenging why isn't this lens showing up in your work. And to your point, this has been a great way for people to engage in that dialogue. You have and I know you've gotten lots of feedback from people all across the country, so much so that you're coming up with the second volume, and there's currently a call out for submission. So do you want to tell us about what that is, and how people can submit and get involved, what you're looking for?
Yeah, sometimes this notion of racial reckoning happening in the U.S. and all parts of the world. The timing of the CRJ, what happened with George Floyd and the other killings of unarmed Black men and women and youth. I think, CRJ came out at a time when it was obviously glaring. The root of racism is just alive and well. It's so resilient, right? So CRJ came into this conversation about racism. So I think it was very it was just really good timing, and we didn't plan it that way. It was supposed to happen that way. And so then once we published, and then people were engaging the book, we decided we wanted to do another project of this magnitude and of this nature. And Denise Baton, again, who's the executive director of LJP, we had settled on doing another call, but it's called colorizing circle practices, naming the silences. And so, basically, we're still pushing the envelope on that. Where what are some of the silences that manifest themselves in these circles? I think we're trying to go more for talking about the more systemic racism that's out there, not just the individual things. So we want to say, as we enter these circles, we just can't leave our experiences, our cultural upbringing, how we see the world, as you said, through whatever lens we have. We just cannot, as we enter the circle, we just can't leave them outside that circle and go and just agree to a certain prescriptions and hope that does it. So we're hoping that, when we name these silences, whatever those silences might be, that just adds that next layer or that other discussion about restorative justice and restorative practices and what goes on in circles. I think we're really wanting to, because of colorizing restorative justice and voicing our realities, now we're looking at circles. We're looked at RJ in a larger sense. Now, what's going on in those circles? What does it mean to be in a racially mixed group of people? And what are those dynamics that happen there? And we want to talk about those. And of course, as well as I do, I know as Native people, when we're in a circle, we're more relaxed, we're more engaged, we're more animated. And then when we have circles of color, which, we have the Black and brown brothers and sisters, that's also such an engaging dynamic. And then yet when a white enters that circle, I see the dynamics begin to shift. And why is that? I mean, back home in my community, man, if the community members are engaged and a white person walks in, we just shift. And I know whites do the same thing. The small towns in rural South Dakota, go to the local cafe or go to the local McDonald's and you see all these white guys sitting around having coffee. You walk in, they all stop talking too. So there's something going on. I don't know if it's a racial dynamic or whatever that is, but I think we want to talk about what goes on in those circles or how we understand and process those circles. And we talked about naming the silences. So we're hoping that people will really bring insights into the circle dynamics. So, maybe someone might have a practice that colorizes that circle in a good way. And that'd be interesting to know or find out and read about. We hope that this next volume will again get people to make submissions, and we're excited about it. We think it'll be this next book project will be just as strong or as stimulating as the first one.
Yeah. And the deadline for submission for this is pretty soon after the deadline for submission of abstract for this is pretty soon after this episode is airing. It's April 1st, right? April Fool's Day, but that's a serious deadline, right? We'll attach the call for contributors, the full description of that in the show notes for people who want to get involved. But we're asking for a just like a 300-word abstract at this point, right?
So it's 300 to 500 words, and what we're concerned about in the abstract is your idea. What is your idea? Why is it important? And I think there's a couple other things. You want to hear your idea, why it's important, and does your idea speak to the issues raised in the call? We got a lot of questions there, and then the narrative. And then why is it important to the greater RJRP community? So basically, we're just looking for ideas in terms of why do you feel it's important? How does it relate to the call? And then it's its impact on the greater community. So that's what we look for in an abstract, is your idea primarily, and why that's important. Now, if you just give me a couple more minutes, let me tell you about these calls. We write, we do things a little bit differently. These calls are 3-4 pages long, but we want to provide so much context. So whoever gets the call, they read it, as opposed to, I've seen other calls for papers or abstracts or proposals. They're just like a paragraph long and maybe bullet points of ideas. Here we want to engage communities of color, indigenous communities in. This is the content and the context of this call, and that's where we have a lot of questions. That's where we have long deadlines. We sent this out on January 17th on the Martin Luther King Day, and we have till April 1st. But we know we want it to have a long deadline so people can talk about this among themselves, share it among themselves, and begin that conversation, even if they don't submit something. We found out one of the first calls, a lot of people were talking about it as something that was much needed. So we thought that's why I have such a long deadline for these calls, is to let it sit and ferment among the community so they can have these discussions. So yeah, April 1st is the deadline, 300 to 500 words. So yeah, that's one of the things.
Beautiful. And if people have questions about that, ljpress@aol.com is a place to ask those questions. It's also where you submit. But again, all of those things will be linked in the show notes, so folks can explore that. And please share that with practitioners, circle keepers of the global majority in your spaces. One, because to your point, these conversations are worth having, worth needed, even if you don't end up submitting. But two, those voices are needed. Those voices are critical in contributing to this larger movement. The other thing that is, I know you're working on a lot of different things, but you're going to be one of the keynote speakers at the NACRJ conference in Chicago in July. Are there any things that you want to tease about what you're going to be sharing there, or why people should show up and participate in that gathering?
Gosh, yeah, I've been giving it a lot of thought, and of course I think the theme of it is real. Oh, what was the name of that? The theme of the NACRJ. Oh, real transformation. There you go. Real transformation. Where are we at? How do we get there? And I have a plan.
Beautiful. Oh, and then you're just gonna have to come to the conference to find out, y'all. We also have the link to that in the show notes, and you're gonna hear a little bit about this right now. This podcast is brought to you in part by a generous grant from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. NACRJ promotes effective forms of justice that are equitable, sustainable, and socially constructive by providing a professional association for educators, practitioners, and others interested in restorative and community justice. The primary means to fulfill this mission are their membership-accessible website and biannual conference. This year, the conference is July 7 through 9 in Chicago. As a 2-time conference attendee and a former Chicago resident, I'm super excited to be joining the conference this year to connect with RJ practitioners all across the world. You can save over $100 on conference registration by signing up with Amplify RJ's group registration at the link in the show notes. You can learn more about NACRJ and membership at nacrj.org. Well, Edward, thank you so much. Before we have you sign off, there are questions that everybody who comes on this podcast answers. So are you ready?
Sure.
In your own words, restorative justice is?
Making things right. Making things right. And what I mean by that is acknowledging a harm has been done, and how to make it right. And And I think that is to me what restorative justice is. Again, I don't want to get into details, but I think I have ideas of how to make things right with respect to my nation and my people. So that's it. How to make things right.
Thank you. As you've been doing this work, and we can say this work broadly in whatever way you want to interpret this, what's been an oh shit moment, or a moment that you messed up, or a moment where it's like, oh, I wish I did something totally different? And what did you learn?
What I have learned is that I wish that we could have done more in terms of and likely do it in the future. But I think one of the things that contributors have done for the first book is how they much engaged that material and really had a lot of discussions around that, whether they be Zoom discussions or webinars or things like that. They were the ones that really sold the book. And I think that is something that we've learned and something we didn't really anticipate, because we were thinking about, well, how do we get the word out? Well, we found out that the contributors, our authors, are the greatest advertisers for their work. And so that was really something that we took and learned, and hopefully we'll do it for this next one too. How we should have done things different. I think we should have done, and we might still put a blurb out on what we expect of abstracts. And I was trying to maybe do that in this podcast.
Beautiful. Well, people have now listened. People know where to get clarification if there is any. So we'll make sure that, people are able to get in touch and share with all the people they need to, and ask the questions that they need to. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or past. Who are they? What is the question you ask the circle?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so 4 people that I would ask is I know one well known in our nation. His name is Tashunka Witko. Settlers know him as Crazy Horse. There would be Tatanka Iokate, which is Sitting Bull, and then Inkbaluta, who is that one's kind of hard to translate. Scarlet Point. And then the 4th one would be like, man, I don't know who the 4th one would be. Maybe Vine Deloria Jr., who would be there, or John Mohawk from the Seneca Nation. But these are basically all Lakota people, and I guess I would ask them why they fought so hard against the overwhelming odds. Why was that important to them? Why did they feel it was so important to even give up their lives for their own nation, knowing that all the odds would indicate that their resistance is futile? It's almost like the Ukrainians against the Russians of today, like outgunned, outmanned, out-resourced, and yet they decided that it was worth the fight. And that's what I would ask them.
Yeah. I know that you are not literally out there writing and shooting, but why do you do it?
Well, I think it's because I think in all these my experiences over the years and my relationships that I've had with settlers and non-settlers alike, is that I think the Lakota people, my nation, we have a right to coexist, irrespective of what the settler narrative says or what others say. We are we were here hundreds of thousands of years before settlers ever came. And I want another 1,000 years from now to be a Lakota people. I don't know how that would look, but I just want us to always be here. So yeah, I think coexistence is such an important and beautiful thing. And I just want to ensure that we are here, that we have a right to exist as a nation and as a people. We have much to contribute to the globe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. What's one thing or a mantra or affirmation you want everyone listening to this to know?
Well, I always talk about what it means to be a good relative. And that, I think, is key. And what I mean by being a good relative is just not in the human sphere of things, but in the sense of the natural world as well. Because I think to be a good relative really puts you on the spot in terms of what your obligations are and what your responsibilities are. And that as a result of that, of being a good relative, you ensure that we also have another saying other than midakoye oyasne, which is all my relations, but we do these things so that the people may live. And I think to experience this life in human form is worth the journey. And so I think that's part of our growth as people. We start this journey, we end this journey, and what was the quality of that journey? Were you a good relative? Did you do any harm? And if you did, how did you make it right?
I first encountered you 3 years ago now at this point, and that specific call has been something that I've come back to a lot. So one, to you, thank you. And to our listeners, I hope that you're able to sit with that as you navigate the rest of today, and as you go about the rest of your week and life moving forward. It's been a really helpful reframe for me. That what does it mean to be a good relative? Now, those two more questions. Who's one person that I should have on the podcast? And you got to help me out.
Oh my gosh. I think it would be important for I would nominate Denise Berton, only because she is a settler, she's white, she's female, but what was her internal, dynamics that were going on? Like what made her gyroscope align itself so she should go this way? And I think her message may have resonance with maybe the white listeners of the podcast, as well as people of color, when it gets down to this larger framework of racial reckoning. I think when whites stand up and step up, it has an impact on other whites. So I would say she might be an individual you might want to put on the podcast.
And I'm sure that I can get that introductory email from you. And then finally, how and where can people support your work in the ways that you want to be supported? I know we've mentioned a couple, right? We've got the call for this new submission in the show notes. You can still order Colorizing Restorative Justice. We'll link that on Living Justice Press. Buy it from the publisher if you can. We've got the NACRJ conference coming up, and links to that will also be in the show notes. But how else can people support you in your work?
Well, I think having more engagement with the contributors of the CRJ for the communities of color, indigenous communities, please submit manuscripts. Even outside the call itself, we're always open to having full-length manuscripts done, or if you have a project, we're looking at manuscripts that deal with circles and restorative justice and restorative practices. So we're always looking for that. Education seems to be the big thing where RJ and RP is at, but yeah, I would say to support, we're just open to getting full full-length manuscripts submitted so we can look at them, and engaging the authors about their manuscript ideas, whether it'd be a good fit for publishing for them and for us. So that's another one. Full-length manuscripts would be good.
Beautiful. Well, that's a challenge to many out there who I know have so much to contribute to this work in this space. Dr. Valandra, thank you so much. This conversation has both warmed my heart and challenged me a lot. And I'm hoping that it's done the same for many of our listeners. Anything else you want to leave the people with?
Just be safe and be a good relative. Yeah, be a good relative.
You heard it. Thank you, everybody, so much for taking a listen this week. We'll be back with another wonderful conversation with someone living this restorative justice life in a week. Until then, take care.
Elise here. Thank you so much to Edward for all you had to offer this episode. I think it's so important that we put decolonization and Indigenous justice at the forefront of restorative justice, because this contributes to every single part of the way that America functions. More likely than not, right now, you are standing or sitting or wherever you are currently on stolen native land. And it's important that we reconcile with that every day, because every day we reap the benefits of a stolen system. Indigenous practices helped inform all of what we know about restorative justice today, and it's important to pay homage to that every single day. Additionally, Edward offered a bit of reflection that I think is really important. He said, "Who and what do you represent?" As someone who lives in America, it's important to reconcile with what does that mean? What does being American mean? Being American means in many ways profiting off of systems that function based on discrimination and harm towards Indigenous communities. In order to reevaluate and reconcile with our role, it's important to understand what space are you taking up and what space have you taken from others. Not only do we have to think about the fact that the physical land was stolen, but we also have to think about what else was taken. Destruction of rights, complete colonization of thought and ideas as well. It's really important to evaluate the fact that colonization stretches way beyond the physical land. How do you respect the land that you stand on? As always, thank you so much for listening, and make sure to check out all the links in the show notes below to hear more from Edward and to hear more from Amplify Restorative Justice. And with that, I'll hear you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.